Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable resilience and, let's say, creative discomfort tolerance of the Viking people who somehow managed to survive Scandinavian winters without central heating. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, or a space heater if you're feeling historically dishonest, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When the temperature outside dropped to absolutely not, the Vikings didn't panic. They simply retreated into their longhouses, large, low, and only slightly less breathable than a modern sauna built in a cow barn. These longhouses were the Vikings' version of winter bunkers, constructed primarily from timber, if you lived near trees, or turf and stone, if you didn't. They were built low to the ground to conserve heat and wide enough to accommodate multiple families, and, in some cases, a few strategically placed cows. Because nothing says comfort like sleeping next to something that chews cud and farts steam. The key to surviving the cold was collective warmth. Think of a longhouse as one big communal thermal battery, human bodies, animal bodies, and a fire pit all operating in cosy, unventilated harmony. It was less house and more survival cuddle bunker. The hearth ran through the centre of the longhouse, acting as both stove and space heater. There were no chimneys because chimneys hadn't been invented yet, or more accurately they had, but not in places where people were still using bones as doorstops. Instead, smoke rose and collected in the rafters, occasionally finding its way out through a hole in the roof or staying right where it was, turning the entire ceiling black and everyone's lungs into wool-lined ashtrays. To modern eyes, Viking homes might seem unbearably smoky, crowded, and oddly intimate. And that's because they were. But for the Vikings, it was the best option short of becoming a snow sculpture. Raised sleeping platforms lined the walls, often stuffed with straw, moss, or whatever was soft and vaguely flammable. Families, and sometimes their goats, all slept in the same space. Not because they loved each other that much, but because warmth wasn't optional, and privacy wasn't invented yet. In short, Viking longhouses weren't comfortable, but they were efficient. They kept people alive during brutal winters, even if they didn't keep them particularly fragrant or rested. Viking fashion was less about runway style, and more about not freezing to death before breakfast. If there was one thing the Norse understood better than raiding, it was layering. And not just in a scarf and mittens way. We're talking full-body wool armour, reinforced with fur, leather, and a complete lack of shame. The base layer? Linen, if you were lucky enough to own some. Linen was light, breathable, and good at wicking sweat. Unfortunately, it also tore easily and was expensive to make, which is why most people skipped straight to wool. Lots of wool. Viking men wore tunics over trousers, with leg wraps that were basically ancient thermal leggings. Women wore long woolen dresses layered with aprons and cloaks. Everyone wore belts to keep things together, and pouches to carry whatever was needed. Knives, flint, or maybe a piece of emergency cheese. Cloaks were essential. They were fastened with brooches, sometimes fur-lined, and if you didn't have one, you probably didn't have much time left either. Boots were made of animal hide, often from cattle or seals, and waterproofed using generous amounts of fat. Viking footwear wasn't pretty, but it was grease-sealed and windproof. The only downside, you smelled like a jerky factory. For the really dedicated, intestines were sometimes used to make waterproof layers. Yes, actual animal guts. Cleaned, scraped, dried, and sewn into a kind of proto-raincoat. It wasn't breathable, but it did keep out snow and rain. And no one was going to question your outfit when you were literally wrapped in internal organs. Hats, mittens, and scarves were all standard, often made from felted wool, which was wool beaten until it gave up its structural integrity and became a warm, dense mat. If you didn't own gloves, you stuffed your hands in your cloak and hoped no one noticed your fingers turning blue. When it came to surviving frigid Scandinavian nights, the Vikings had one culinary rule: eat like your life depends on it, because it actually does. Calories weren't indulgence, they were insulation. Viking winter cuisine wasn't elegant, but it was dense, fatty, and almost aggressively practical. Let's start with the essentials: meat, dairy, grain, and preserved fish. Lots and lots of preserved fish. They smoked it, salted it, dried it, fermented it, then apologised to no one. Lutefisk, for example, is whitefish soaked in lye until it's equal parts food and dare. Not delicious, but impressively immune to spoilage. For heartier meals, stews were the go-to. Vikings threw whatever they had into a pot over the hearth: cuts of meat, root vegetables, oats, even sour milk. The longer it cooked, the better. The result wasn't glamorous, but it stuck to your ribs, and possibly to the bowl. Dairy was a year-round staple, but especially critical in winter. Cheese and butter were made during the warmer months and stored for cold season rationing. And not the nice creamy brie sort. Think hard, salty, wheel-shaped pucks of milk-solid survival. Perfect for chewing, trading, or hurling at wolves. They also made skyr, which was sort of a yogurt, sort of a cheese, and definitely a Viking version of "you'll eat it and you'll be grateful." High in protein and incredibly sour, it was the culinary equivalent of a slap to the face, invigorating but confusing. Grains were stored in bulk. Barley and rye formed the basis for flatbreads and porridge. Viking bread was dense, dark, and sometimes baked with crushed tree bark to stretch the flour further. Again, not tasty, but if your blood sugar stayed above freezing, it was doing its job. And finally, alcohol. Ale and mead weren't just for feasts. They were caloric, mildly antiseptic, and deeply comforting when your toes had gone numb. Mead especially made you forget that you lived in a smoke-filled shed with livestock and 6 relatives. And if it tasted terrible, even better, no one would steal your leftovers. When winter hit hard, and in Scandinavia it always did, Vikings turned to their most reliable source of heat: other mammals. Bringing animals indoors wasn't considered odd, it was considered efficient. Chickens, pigs, sheep, goats, and even cattle were invited inside Viking longhouses, not for companionship, but for body warmth. Think of it as medieval central heating powered by mooing. The livestock were usually housed in a section of the longhouse called the byre, essentially the garage-meet-stable portion of the structure. A low dividing wall kept animals and humans semi-separated. And by semi-separated, we mean close enough to smell, but not close enough to pet without consequences. On brutally cold nights, boundaries blurred. A family might huddle closer to the byre. Children might nap beside a sheep. If the ox was warm and willing, congratulations. That was your pillow now. Not cosy, but undeniably effective. The logic was simple. Animals generate heat. A cow can put out as much warmth as a small campfire, and doesn't require kindling. In extreme conditions, that warmth could mean the difference between waking up frostbitten and waking up only slightly annoyed by the snoring pig. Of course, the side effects were less charming. You had to deal with the noise, the smell, and the occasional hoof in the wrong place. And yet, Vikings didn't complain. They understood a universal truth: warmth now, dignity later. It wasn't just about heat either. Keeping animals close protected them from theft, predators, and freezing to death outside. Livestock were a family's wealth, food supply, and heating system, all in one shaggy, hay-eating package. In many cases, longhouses were designed with this in mind. Builders intentionally channeled warmth from the byre toward the living quarters. It was architecture by survival instinct. Simple, effective, and unapologetically fragrant. Vikings didn't just survive the cold. They endured it with a disturbing amount of cheer. When the fire burned low, the goats got cranky, and the smoke turned your longhouse into a barbecue pit, you still had one last defense against the cold: each other. Huddling wasn't just warmth, it was community engineering. Families slept side by side on raised platforms, layered in wool, and whatever scraps of hide weren't being used to patch the roof. Privacy was a myth. Comfort was a rumour. But warmth? That was shared. Children nestled between adults. The elderly were treated like heated relics. Dogs and cats weren't pets. They were thermal devices with whiskers. Everyone packed in, breathing each other's smoky, cabbage-scented air and pretending they couldn't hear Uncle Bjorn snoring like a wounded elk. But this wasn't just physical survival. Winter isolation could rot your mind faster than your toes. That's where Viking humour came in, rough, blunt, and strangely effective. They told sagas and sang songs, often about warriors freezing to death heroically, which somehow made everyone feel better. They roasted each other with sharp wit and zero filter. Nothing beat back seasonal depression, quite like mocking your cousin for falling in the latrine last week. Feasting was another essential morale booster. During midwinter, food that had been hoarded since fall was brought out in generous portions, not just to celebrate Yule, but to remind everyone, hey, we're still alive, and look, we have turnips. Vikings also held games and competitions inside, sometimes including riddles, board games like a kind of proto-chess with more betrayal, or wrestling matches that occasionally knocked over the livestock. The goal wasn't just entertainment, it was distraction, from the cold, the dark, and the very real possibility that spring might never come. But most of all, they survived winter because they expected it to be hard. There was no complaining, no sense of entitlement to comfort. Misery was the default setting. Anything better was a bonus. Insulation, as we know it today, involves fiberglass, foam, or other high-tech materials with catchy brand names and warning labels. The Vikings had no such luxury. Their insulation plan was simple. Shove as much nature into your walls as possible, and hope it holds. A Viking longhouse wasn't a drafty shack by accident. It was by design, sort of. These homes were engineered for heat retention, using whatever materials were available. Timber, if you lived near forests. Turf and stone if you didn't. The walls were thick, sometimes up to a metre, and the idea was to trap heat by any means necessary. Between the logs or stones, they packed moss, straw, mud, or animal hair. Anything fibrous, dense, and vaguely warm-smelling got stuffed into the cracks. It wasn't glamorous, and you probably didn't want to lean against the walls barefoot, but it worked. Roofs were often thatched or, even better, layered with sod, aka literal grass and dirt. This wasn't some eco-hipster design trend. Turf roofs were excellent for insulation, decent at shedding water, and, under the right conditions, occasionally grew weeds or mushrooms. Indoor gardening? Maybe. Accidental salad bar? Possibly. The floor was usually just packed earth, sometimes layered with straw or rushes that were swapped out periodically. And by periodically, we mean whenever the stench could no longer be rationalised as rustic. Windows were rare and small, if they existed at all. Light came from fire or strategically placed smoke holes. Why no big windows? Because glass was expensive, drafts were deadly, and Vikings didn't care much about natural light when it was pitch black outside for 3 months anyway. And yet, this slapdash collection of timber, turf, and biological fluff was surprisingly effective. It turned a longhouse into a slow cooker of communal body heat and goat breath, perfectly capable of withstanding the Scandinavian winter. It wasn't a spa. It wasn't breathable. It probably didn't pass any modern building codes. But it kept Viking families alive, warmish, and just smoky enough to preserve their food and confuse insects. When the fire burned low and the wind howled outside like an angry frost demon, Vikings relied on a time-tested method to survive the night. Sleep like your life depends on it, because it does. Viking sleeping arrangements were less private bedroom and more thermal mass strategy. Whole families, sometimes including distant relatives and whichever livestock weren't feeling well, slept on raised wooden platforms lining the longhouse walls. These beds were topped with straw, moss, or hay, and layered in fur, wool, and resignation. There were no sheets, no duvets, no embroidered pillowcases. If it was soft and didn't bite, it went on the bed. Everyone slept in their clothes. Changing into pajamas in sub-zero temperatures was a good way to become a Viking popsicle, so layers stayed on. Boots were sometimes even worn to bed. If that sounds ridiculous, remember, frostbite doesn't care about your dignity. Infants were bundled up and held close. Children were often placed between parents or older siblings, not for emotional bonding, but for pure logistical insulation. It was essentially a family-sized meatloaf of humans and wool. Couples slept together, obviously, but so did anyone who could squeeze in. Modesty was not a priority. Warmth was. If someone's feet wandered a bit, that was called survival, not scandal. Wool cloaks were draped over bodies like medieval thermal blankets. Animal hides, especially from reindeer or bears, added another layer of warmth. If you had a bearskin blanket, you were either very rich or very lucky, or very committed to hunting terrifying things in winter. In wealthier households, or during particularly brutal winters, heated stones or bricks were sometimes placed under bedding. Yes, the Vikings had their own version of a hot water bottle, only heavier and more likely to burn your thigh. And if the fire in the hearth went out during the night, you didn't relight it immediately. You pulled someone closer and muttered something in Old Norse that probably translated to, "Don't you dare steal the fur again." In short, sleeping in a Viking longhouse wasn't glamorous. It was smoky, cramped, and had a 100% chance of snoring. But it worked. In theory, smoke was supposed to drift up and escape through the thatched roof, or a vent near the top of the structure. In practice, it clung to the rafters like an unwanted guest and slowly filtered down into everyone's lungs. You didn't breathe fresh air in a Viking house. You breathed experienced air. By the end of a winter evening, your chest felt like it had smoked a pork shoulder, and so did the pork shoulder. Oddly enough, this wasn't all bad. The smoke helped preserve meats and fish hung from the rafters. It also kept insects and mould at bay. Plus, the constant low-level exposure probably gave every Viking the respiratory system of a Victorian coal miner. Still, the downsides were hard to ignore. Red eyes, hacking coughs, and ceilings stained darker than Odin's mood. Small children and elders likely suffered most, being shorter and therefore closer to the densest layers of smoke. You know, because physics is a jerk. Some families tried to manage this by building raised platforms, or sleeping closer to the ground to avoid the worst of the haze. Others simply powered through, eyes watering as they stirred stew, or tried to find their bed without tripping over a semi-cooked goat. A handful of Viking homes, the upscale kind, had actual smoke outlets in the roof. But for the average Norse family, smoke was just part of the ambience. It warmed you, seasoned your food, and reminded you every single day that fire was both a friend and a flaming health hazard. And if things got too smoky, you opened a door, let in the fresh air, and froze your toes off. When the darkest days of the year rolled in and the sun decided to take a month off, the Vikings turned to an ancient and highly effective survival tool: celebration. You can't freeze to death if you're too busy drinking and yelling around a bonfire. Enter Yule, the midwinter festival that was equal parts religious observance, survival tactic, and excuse to eat everything that wasn't nailed down. It usually began around the winter solstice and stretched for days, sometimes even weeks, depending on how generous the mead supply was. This wasn't just a party, it was a psychological life raft. Yule lifted spirits when morale was scraping the frost-covered floor. It gave people something to look forward to besides not dying. Families gathered, animals were sacrificed, for blessings and for dinner, and great fires were lit to symbolize the return of the sun. These weren't romantic little flames. These were roaring infernos that practically dared the night to come closer. They feasted on preserved meat, drank ale and mead, told sagas, played games, and sometimes, just sometimes, they sang. and not politely either. Viking singing probably sounded like someone trying to charm a thunderstorm with a battle cry. The Yule log, now a quaint dessert or decorative centerpiece, was originally a literal log that burned for days. It was supposed to represent warmth, continuity, and not freezing your family. Practical and symbolic. Very Viking. There were also supernatural concerns. Winter was considered a time when spirits, trolls, and restless ancestors wandered freely, so rituals, charms, and offerings were made to keep the peace, and possibly to convince those spirits not to steal your goat. And yes, a lot of modern Christmas traditions got borrowed from Yule. Evergreens, feasting, gift-giving, dragging dead trees indoors. All Norse approved. But above all, Yule was about enduring together. In a world with no light switches, no vitamin D supplements, and no concept of seasonal depression, the Vikings created joy from scratch, with fire, food, and an unwavering belief that the cold would pass. Because it always did. And when it didn't? Well, at least you went out with a full belly and a story worth retelling. In Viking Age Scandinavia, gold was nice. Silver was better. But wool? Wool was life. Wool wasn't just a material. It was a Viking's primary weapon against the cold, second only to fire and the occasional cuddle with a sheep. It was spun, woven, stitched, and layered into everything. Cloaks, tunics, socks, mittens, underclothes, and blankets. If it could be made from wool, it was. The reason was simple. Wool works. Unlike cotton, which clings to you like a cold, wet betrayal, wool retains heat even when damp, which is handy when your local weather forecast is freezing fog with a side of regret. Every household, especially in rural farms, raised sheep, not for cuteness or cheese, but for the glorious, itchy miracle growing on their backs. Spinning wool was a year-round job, usually done by women and children. In winter, it became the closest thing to heating the future. The Vikings didn't do fashion for fashion's sake, but their woolen garments were surprisingly tailored. Tunics were fitted, cloaks were cut to allow mobility. Leg wraps were expertly bound to avoid tripping over yourself mid-blizzard. Form followed function, and warmth followed form. In fact, the quality of your wool said a lot about you. Coarse wool meant you were poor or practical. Soft, tightly woven wool? That was luxury, the Viking equivalent of a cashmere hoodie. Wealthy Vikings could afford dyed wool, sometimes even imported colours like blue or red. Everyone else wore 37 shades of sheep. And don't forget felt, wool that had been soaked, stomped, and abused until it fused into a windproof mat. Vikings used felt for hats, boots, mittens, and occasionally to insulate walls. It was like making fabric from rage and foot sweat, but it worked. Wool garments were patched, repaired, and passed down. Nothing was wasted. Even wool scraps were rewoven into socks or stuffing. A good cloak could last generations, assuming it didn't catch fire, blow away, or get buried with you as part of your going-away outfit. It may sound like a contradiction, but some of the coldest weather people in history were also huge fans of getting even colder, on purpose. Yes, the Vikings had a thing for saunas and ice baths, because why merely survive the cold when you can challenge it to a duel? Viking sweat lodges, called badstoffer, were small huts or pits, built with stone and turf, where hot stones were doused with water to produce steam. You'd sit inside, half naked and sweating like a berserker at a summer feast, while the outside world froze solid. It was a hot, humid, smoky break from the ice-crusted reality beyond the door. Then, and here's the real fun, some Vikings would run straight outside and plunge into ice water or roll in snow, voluntarily, for health reasons. Or, more realistically, because they were trying to prove to themselves, the gods, and anyone watching, that they feared absolutely nothing, not even hypothermia. These hot-cold rituals weren't just about showing off. They were practical. Sweating helped cleanse the body, or at least made you feel like you were doing something about the fact you hadn't bathed properly in weeks. The extreme temperature shifts also boosted circulation, cleared sinuses, and made you temporarily forget you lived in a world without insulation or painkillers. They also had a social function. Saunas were communal, meaning families or groups sweated and froze together, sometimes as part of rituals, sometimes just to bond while slowly steaming their regrets. And of course, steam rooms doubled as birthing rooms, healing spaces, and makeshift hospitals. If something needed fixing, heating, or flushing out, the Viking answer was almost always, let's cook it first, then freeze it for good measure. These traditions were so effective they stuck around. In fact, modern Nordic countries still embrace sauna culture, though these days they tend to leave the goats out of it. Surviving the cold was one thing. Surviving the boredom, that was its own kind of warfare. With long, dark nights, frozen ground, and months of not being able to raid, sail, or plant anything, Vikings had to get creative about passing the time indoors without losing their minds, or murdering their relatives. First up, repairs and prep work. Winter was prime time for sharpening weapons, fixing tools, restringing bows, and mending clothes. If your shirt had a hole in October, you'd better believe it was patched by candlelight in December, unless you enjoyed frostbite in creative new places. Then there was spinning and weaving. Women, children, and anyone with 2 functioning hands spent endless hours turning wool into yarn and yarn into garments. It wasn't glamorous, but you knew your cloak didn't make itself. Every stitch was another layer between you and death by wind chill. Crafting also came into play. Wood carving, bone tools, antler combs. Winter was when practical turned artistic. The longhouse might look bleak from the outside, but inside, it was a hive of quiet productivity and occasional swearing when someone dropped a needle. Storytelling was the big one. The Vikings didn't have Netflix, but they did have sagas. Epic oral tales of gods, heroes, monsters, and other family members who made poor life choices. These stories were passed down by firelight, each retelling slightly exaggerated for dramatic effect. Thor didn't just kill the giant. He punched the moon afterward, probably. Games helped too. Vikings played board games like Hnefatafl, a strategy game that makes chess look like tic-tac-toe, and dice games that combined luck, bluffing, and possibly a little gambling. Some families also played riddles or staged mock duels when things got really dull. Of course, alcohol helped lubricate all of this. Mead made storytelling funnier, crafting sloppier, and family squabbles slightly more entertaining for bystanders. The Vikings didn't just fight the cold with cloaks, fires, and a questionable relationship with livestock. They fought it with mindset. And not the inspirational poster kind, more like a grim, bone-deep refusal to be impressed by nature trying to kill them. For the average Norse person, winter wasn't unexpected or tragic. It was simply part of the calendar, like planting season, or time to raid France again. They didn't dread winter. They prepared for it, expected it, and met it with the emotional equivalent of a shrug. That wasn't an accident. Viking culture trained people from birth to see hardship not as a problem, but as a proving ground. Cold, pain, hunger. That wasn't failure. That was character development. You didn't complain. You endured. Ideally with a stoic grimace and maybe a sarcastic comment about how this was still better than dealing with taxes. This mindset wasn't just cultural. It was spiritual. Norse mythology is filled with frost giants, endless winters, and gods who power through suffering like it's a casual Tuesday. When your belief system includes a literal apocalypse called Fimbulwinter, an endless all-consuming freeze before the world ends, you stop flinching at a little snow. This mental toughness was reinforced socially. Weakness wasn't mocked exactly. It was simply ignored. No one wanted to be the one who couldn't handle the dark. So people kept going. They stayed busy. They joked about the cold. They laughed in the face of despair, then poured another mug of mead and kept sewing their 43rd mitten. Even children were taught to tough it out early. If your fingers were cold, you used your elbows. If your toes were numb, walk faster. If you fell through ice and survived, congratulations. you were now interesting enough to tell stories about. Was it healthy? Probably not. Effective? Absolutely. Modern survival manuals talk about the importance of mindset. The Vikings already knew. They didn't see winter as an enemy to be defeated. They saw it as a test, one they had already passed 100 times before. And that's how they survived the coldest nights. With fire, fur, and a psychological middle finger raised to the wind. If there's one thing the Vikings understood better than most, it was this: no one survives winter alone. You can have the warmest cloak, the fattest goat, and the sturdiest longhouse. But without community, you're just a cold person with great accessories. Viking society was built on interdependence. Families didn't live in isolation. They clustered in farms, villages, or settlements, often made up of extended kin and close allies. When winter hit, this network became your literal lifeline. Food was shared, firewood was pooled. If your roof collapsed, someone helped you fix it. If your child got sick, someone offered herbs, prayers, or at the very least, a sympathetic grunt. This wasn't generosity for generosity's sake. It was survival math. The more people you kept alive through winter, the more hands you had come spring, for farming, sailing, fighting, or just holding back the cows during calving season. Helping others helped yourself, even if that meant sharing your last smoked fish with a cousin you didn't particularly like. During midwinter feasts like Yule, this bond was reinforced with food, storytelling, and low-grade drunken philosophy. These weren't just parties, they were social glue, keeping morale intact and reminding everyone they weren't facing the darkness alone. Even resource storage reflected this mindset. Communal granaries, meat cellars, and smokehouses weren't uncommon. If one family's supplies ran out, others pitched in. Not because it was polite, but because winter was long, and one weak link in the chain could drag down the entire group. Justice and leadership played a role too. Local chieftains, or godi, priests and legal leaders, were responsible for maintaining order, but also making sure no one froze in a ditch. Their reputation depended on their ability to manage both law and logistics. A respected leader was one who could settle a dispute and organize firewood collection. There was also, of course, peer pressure. If you tried to hoard food or skip your chores, your neighbours would notice. And in Viking society, getting judged by the entire village was just slightly worse than death. At the end of it all, the snow, the darkness, the livestock snoring in your bed, one truth remained. The Vikings didn't just survive winter. They turned it into a proving ground. Every layer of wool, every puff of smoke, every grim joke around the hearth was part of a cultural blueprint designed for one purpose: endurance. Winter wasn't an obstacle. It was an opponent. And the Vikings? They trained year-round for the match. They adapted constantly. If the longhouse was too draughty, they patched it with moss. If the stew was thin, they made it thicker with turnip. If the nights dragged on for weeks, they filled them with stories, games, rituals, and the occasional impromptu wrestling match between cousins. No central heating? Fine. They built fire pits. No waterproof gear. They invented it out of sheep and stubbornness. No antidepressants. They had sagas, mead, and the kind of dark humour that makes seasonal depression afraid to show up. And while other civilizations slowed down in winter, the Vikings used it to get stronger. Weapons were repaired. Children were trained. New ideas were shaped around the fire. When the ice thawed, these people didn't stumble blinking into the sun. They came out ready. Ready to plant crops, build ships, make alliances, or sail across oceans to places warmer, richer, or simply worth looting. Winter didn't weaken them. It hardened them, made them leaner, meaner, and more inventive. Their success didn't come from magic or divine insulation. It came from a relentless, often smoky commitment to survival, by any means necessary. Whether that meant sleeping under a goat, steaming in a hut, or eating yogurt that doubled as industrial sealant, they did it. And they did it together. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin on the edge of the Kentucky wilderness, a place where survival was never guaranteed, and education was an afterthought. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard-working but uneducated farmer and carpenter. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was quiet, gentle, and literate, a rarity on the frontier. Together, they lived in near poverty, scratching out a life from thin soil and thick woods. The cabin itself had no windows, no floor, and certainly no bookshelves. Abraham's world, for much of his early life, was one of candlelight, silence, and endless labour. He would grow up chopping wood, carrying water, and wearing clothes that were more patch than fabric. There was no formal schooling in those early years. In fact, Lincoln would later estimate he had less than a single year of proper education in his entire life. But he had something more powerful, a restless mind and an aching hunger to learn. When Nancy Hanks died in 1818, possibly from milk sickness, Abraham was only 9 years old. Her death left a void in the boy's life that would never truly close. She had been his emotional anchor, the one who saw something different in him. After her burial, which was done by hand in the forest behind their farm, young Abe whittled a wooden marker himself. It was rough, crude, and soaked with tears, but it said everything. He remembered her. A few months later, Thomas remarried a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. Unlike the stereotypical wicked stepmother, Sarah brought warmth, books, and structure. She recognized Lincoln's intelligence and encouraged his curiosity. Between chores, he devoured everything he could get his hands on: Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, the Bible. If he couldn't get a book, he'd write his own thoughts with charcoal on wooden shingles. This boy, barefoot and bone-thin, with a face too serious for his age, was already forging something within himself. The world hadn't given him much. No money, no connections, no ease. But he had a fire inside that couldn't be smothered. And in that tiny cabin in the Kentucky woods, Abraham Lincoln began the long, improbable climb toward greatness. As Lincoln grew into his teenage years, life on the frontier didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. His family moved again, this time to the dense, swampy forests of Indiana. Every day was a battle against the elements, clearing trees, ploughing thick clay soil, and surviving brutal winters with little more than a hearth fire and hope. But while his body was moulded by the axe and the land, his mind remained somewhere else entirely. He became known among neighbours not for his strength, though he was impressively strong, but for his towering height and peculiar habit of reading during every spare moment. He'd carry books while walking, recite Shakespeare by memory while tending fences, and sit under trees scribbling thoughts into the margins of whatever scrap paper he could find. His humour began to develop too. Dry, observational, often self-deprecating. He was the odd one, the gangly teen who quoted Jefferson, while others traded hunting stories. Lincoln had an awkward social presence. He was shy but talkative, strange yet magnetic. When he did speak, people listened. They couldn't help it. His words were clear, powerful, sometimes funny, but always aimed straight at something true. His moral compass, even then, pointed due north. He hated cruelty. He hated slavery. And he hated the way ignorance was used to justify both. Despite his lack of formal education, Lincoln began to develop a passion for law. The idea that words, not fists, could win battles intrigued him. He taught himself how to write clearly and argue logically. He read every book of law he could find. At night, others might be drinking or gambling. Lincoln would be in a dim room, reading Blackstone's commentaries by candlelight. By his early 20s, he left home for good. He worked as a flatboatman on the Mississippi River, witnessing firsthand the horrors of the slave trade in New Orleans. Those images would stay with him, seared into his conscience. When he returned, he moved to New Salem, Illinois, and began to reinvent himself. He taught himself grammar, joined the local debating society, and, through sheer force of will, began the long march toward becoming a lawyer. He had no diploma, no degree, no pedigree, just a belief that knowledge was power and that it could be carved, like everything else in his life, with effort, vision, and a little bit of pain. By the time Abraham Lincoln became a lawyer, he was already a legend in central Illinois, not because of prestige, but because of presence. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into a room and demanded attention with expensive clothes or polished charm. He was often rumpled, his trousers too short, his coat ill-fitted. But when he stood to speak, people leaned in. He had something more valuable than fashion: clarity, honesty, and relatability. Lincoln's legal career was unconventional. He didn't attend law school. He read law books borrowed from generous attorneys and passed the bar exam through self-study. Once admitted, he took to the 8th Judicial Circuit, a vast network of rural courts that he travelled by horseback, sometimes for weeks at a time. The roads were mud in the spring, dust in the summer, and ice in the winter. He slept in taverns, log cabins, and under the stars. But he loved it. What set Lincoln apart in court wasn't just his logic. It was his empathy. He could connect with jurors in a way polished lawyers never could. He'd speak plainly, paint vivid stories, and treat even the smallest farmer or poorest widow with respect. One farmer said, "He makes you feel like he's one of us, not above us." And that was the truth. Lincoln never forgot where he came from, and he never pretended to be anything he wasn't. But he wasn't soft. In court, when a case mattered, when he believed in it, he was relentless. His speeches could be slow, even awkward, but they built momentum. He'd lay facts like bricks, one after another, until the opposing side crumbled under their own contradictions. His cross-examinations were gentle traps. He'd lull witnesses into comfort, then spring a question that shattered their testimony. Over time, Lincoln became known as Honest Abe. It wasn't a campaign slogan. It was earned. He returned fees if he thought a case was unjust. He refused to represent clients who lied. And when other lawyers cut corners, he simply walked away. His reputation grew as a lawyer who understood the law and the land. But behind the scenes, another fire was smouldering. Politics. The law had taught him how people worked. Now he wanted to help change the system they lived in. And as slavery crept further into the national conversation, Lincoln's quiet conscience was about to roar. Lincoln's first real foray into politics wasn't exactly meteoric. In 1832, at just 23 years old, he ran for the Illinois state legislature and lost. But failure didn't discourage him. If anything, it clarified what he needed to do: listen more, learn more, and meet people where they were. 2 years later, he tried again and won. In Springfield, the new capital, Lincoln quickly became known for his measured speeches, dry wit, and moral conviction. He didn't shout, he didn't scheme, but when he stood up in the State House and spoke, people remembered it. He wasn't interested in cheap victories or flashy slogans. His goal was deeper: understanding the machinery of law, society, and justice. Lincoln aligned himself with the Whig Party, a group that believed in modernization, infrastructure, and limiting executive power. But even as a Whig, he remained cautious about ambition. He often joked about being too ugly for politics. He read voraciously, debated energetically, but never seemed to lust for power the way other men did. If anything, politics seemed to be a burden he accepted rather than chased. During his 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, Lincoln built alliances with farmers, merchants, and other lawyers. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but often the most trusted. He developed a reputation for being principled, especially regarding slavery. Though he wasn't yet calling for abolition, he firmly opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. He called it unjust, immoral, a national hypocrisy. In 1846, Lincoln made the leap to national politics, winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. There, he took a bold and unpopular stance against the Mexican-American War, calling it unconstitutional and unnecessary. This wasn't a winning move politically. His district didn't like it. He served a single term, and didn't run again. Back in Springfield, he returned to his law practice, married Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a slave-holding Kentucky family, and tried to live a quieter life. But the nation was changing rapidly. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the expansion of slavery were tearing the country apart. Lincoln might have left politics, but politics hadn't left him. The debates were growing louder, bloodier. The Union was beginning to crack, and the man once known for his caution was about to rise, not as a candidate, but as a conscience. By the 1850s, the issue of slavery no longer simmered. It boiled. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, ignited fierce violence and deeper division. Bleeding Kansas became a national symbol of chaos. For Abraham Lincoln, it was a turning point. He couldn't stay silent any longer. He returned to the political stage not with bluster, but with moral urgency. He joined the newly formed Republican Party, a coalition of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists, all united against the expansion of slavery. Lincoln wasn't a radical abolitionist. He didn't call for immediate emancipation yet, but he believed deeply that slavery was wrong, and that allowing it to spread into new states was both dangerous and unjust. In 1858, he was thrust into the national spotlight during his Senate campaign against Stephen A. Douglas, one of the most famous politicians in America. The two agreed to a series of debates across Illinois, and what followed became one of the most famous political showdowns in American history, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas defended popular sovereignty, the idea that each state should choose whether to allow slavery. Lincoln countered with clarity. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he declared. If slavery continued to spread, it would tear the Union apart. He argued that the nation couldn't endure permanently half slave and half free. He didn't win that Senate race, but he won something greater: national attention. Newspapers reprinted his words across the country. People who had never heard of Lincoln before now whispered about the lanky lawyer from Illinois with the deep-set eyes and deeper convictions. Though he lost, he'd proven himself. He stood toe-to-toe with one of the great orators of the time, and never flinched. He challenged the nation's comfort, not for personal gain, but because his conscience demanded it. Privately, Lincoln wrestled with the enormity of the issue. He once wrote that if slavery isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. But he also knew that acting too quickly could shatter the fragile Union. Still, the die was cast. The national mood was shifting, and Lincoln was rising with it, not as a politician with easy answers, but as a voice of moral clarity in a time of moral fog. By 1860, America stood on the edge of a knife. Sectional tensions had reached a breaking point. Slavery wasn't just a moral debate anymore. It was a political firestorm. Southern states threatened secession, and the Republican Party was scrambling to find a leader who could unite the North without sparking immediate war. That unlikely figure turned out to be Abraham Lincoln. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, he was not the frontrunner. In fact, most expected the nomination to go to Senator William Seward of New York, a polished statesman with decades of political experience. But Lincoln had something the others didn't: a clean reputation, a moderate tone, and powerful momentum from his debates with Douglas. His team campaigned hard behind the scenes, emphasizing his frontier roots and personal honesty. Lincoln was portrayed as the self-made man, the rail splitter who rose from nothing. His humble beginnings weren't a liability. They were a symbol of American potential. By the third ballot, he secured the nomination, and the political world blinked in surprise. The general election was bitter and fractured. The Democratic Party split in two, with northern and southern factions backing different candidates. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on most southern ballots, but in the north and west, he carried immense support. On November 6, 1860, he was elected the 16th President of the United States with just 40% of the popular vote, but a decisive electoral majority. He didn't celebrate. In fact, the mood was grim. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to secede. 6 more southern states followed before Lincoln even took office. The country was unraveling faster than anyone expected. As he prepared to travel from Springfield to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration, Lincoln received death threats daily. Some warned he wouldn't survive the journey. Security was so tight that he had to sneak into the capital by train under the cover of night, disguised and unannounced. This was not the triumphant arrival of a conqueror. It was the reluctant entrance of a president-elect whose election had cracked the Union. When Lincoln finally took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, he faced a country divided, angry, and armed. And yet, in his address, he reached not for vengeance, but for peace. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "We must not be enemies." But the winds of war were already howling at the door. Barely a month after Abraham Lincoln took office, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. What followed was the bloodiest conflict in American history, a brutal test not just of military might, but of Lincoln's character, leadership, and resolve. Lincoln had no military background. He had briefly served as a captain in the Black Hawk War, but had never seen combat. Now, he was commander-in-chief of a nation at war with itself. He spent long nights in the War Department, reading telegrams, studying maps, and learning strategy on the fly. He read books on warfare, questioned his generals, and obsessed over troop movements. He wasn't a warrior by nature, but he became one by necessity. His early presidency was marked by frustration. General after general disappointed him. George McClellan, in particular, had the loyalty of the troops, but the caution of a man afraid to fight. Lincoln, exasperated by delays and excuses, once asked, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a while." But Lincoln's real genius wasn't just in battlefield decisions. It was in vision. He understood that this war wasn't just about states' rights or secession. It was about the very soul of the nation. Could a country built on liberty survive half enslaved? At first, Lincoln moved cautiously on slavery, fearing that aggressive abolition would push border states into the Confederacy. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, his thinking evolved. The moral issue and the military one became inseparable. Slavery, he concluded, was the engine of the Confederate economy and morale. If it wasn't destroyed, the rebellion would never die. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate-held territories free. It didn't free everyone overnight, but it changed everything. The war was no longer just a fight to preserve the Union. It was a fight for human freedom. Internationally, it closed the door on British or French support for the Confederacy. Domestically, it gave black men the moral and legal justification to join the Union Army, which thousands did, fighting for a country that had long denied them citizenship. Lincoln had transformed from the log cabin lawyer into a wartime president wielding not only authority, but moral thunder. As the war dragged into its 4th year, Lincoln bore its burden alone at the top, thinner, greyer, and visibly aged. Every day brought fresh casualty lists. Towns became graveyards. He received letters from grieving mothers and wives, each demanding to know why their sons and husbands had died. And though he never fought on a battlefield, Lincoln carried the war in his eyes and on his shoulders. His cabinet was a mix of political rivals, men who once ran against him and didn't always respect him. But Lincoln managed them like a maestro, balancing ambition with purpose. He didn't rule by fear or force. He ruled with patience, stories, and clarity. Even his critics began to admit the man had steel beneath the smile. And then came Gettysburg. The battle in July 1863 was a turning point. Over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in 3 days of horror. Months later, Lincoln travelled to Pennsylvania to deliver a short speech at the new cemetery. It wasn't meant to be headline-making, just a few words of reflection. But in just 272 words, he rewrote the purpose of the war. that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address wasn't grandiose. It was restrained, reverent, and eternal. And it made clear that this war wasn't just about unity. It was about redemption, remaking the nation into what it had always claimed to be. As the 1864 presidential election loomed, Lincoln faced deep opposition. The war was still raging, and his support was crumbling. Even within his own party, there were calls to replace him on the ticket. Many believed he'd lose to Democrat George McClellan, the very general he had fired. But as Union victories mounted late that year, especially General Sherman's capture of Atlanta, momentum swung back in Lincoln's favor. He was re-elected with a decisive margin. Still, Lincoln didn't gloat. "It is not in my nature to triumph over anyone," he said. The war was nearly won, but Lincoln knew peace would be harder. The Union could be rebuilt with muskets. But the nation's soul? That would take something much deeper. Mercy, vision, and healing. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Cities fell one after another. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was burning. General Robert E. Lee's army was running out of supplies, soldiers, and time. And yet, Lincoln showed no joy. Victory for him was never about punishment. It was about restoration. In his second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, Lincoln spoke not as a conqueror, but as a moral philosopher. "With malice toward none, with charity for all," he said, "with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in." These were not the words of a politician looking to crush his enemies. They were the words of a father trying to save his broken family. On April 9th, Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery, through the ratification of the 13th Amendment, had been abolished. For the first time in centuries, the nation took a trembling step toward the ideals it had professed in 1776. But just as the country exhaled, tragedy struck. Only 5 days after the surrender, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theatre in Washington. In the middle of the performance, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth crept into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. He died the next morning, April 15th, 1865. The nation mourned like never before. Black Americans, many newly freed, wept in the streets. Former enemies, even in the South, acknowledged the depth of the loss. He had been their best hope for reconciliation, a man who never saw politics as war and never let hatred take root in his heart. Lincoln didn't live to see Reconstruction or to heal the wounds his presidency had helped expose. But his death transformed him from a leader into a symbol of freedom, unity, and the painful price of moral progress. From the dirt floor of a Kentucky cabin to the highest office in the land, Abraham Lincoln rose without money, without privilege, and without cruelty. He led a nation through its darkest hour not with blinding brilliance, but with steady, stubborn light. And that light, dimmed by an assassin's bullet, still burns in the story of America. When we imagine the ancient world, we usually think of mighty empires, glittering temples, and epic battles. What we rarely consider is how these people pooped. Yet sanitation, or the lack of it, shaped daily life as much as any king or war. Behind every marble palace or clay brick home, someone had to deal with the mess. And in a time without flush buttons or scented sprays, that was a far more public and pungent affair than we like to admit. Toilets, in the ancient world, weren't just about comfort. They were about survival. Human waste carries disease, and when it's poorly managed, as it often was, entire communities suffered. Dysentery, cholera, and parasitic infections were frequent, invisible killers. In cities without sanitation, waste flowed through the streets, soaked into wells, and clung to sandals. But in places that took sanitation seriously, something remarkable happened. Life expectancy rose, plagues lessened, and urban centres flourished. Surprisingly, some of the world's oldest civilizations developed systems that wouldn't look entirely out of place today. The Indus Valley cities had street-wide drainage and brick toilets. The Minoans built ceramic pipes and flushing mechanisms. The Romans? They practically turned waste management into an art form. And while other societies, like the Vikings or early Chinese dynasties, handled things a bit more rustically, even they had methods that reflected cultural ideas about health, modesty, and the natural world. But let's be clear, ancient toilets were not always private, not always clean, and certainly not dignified. Communal latrines were often the norm, especially in military camps or urban centres. Picture 20 stone holes in a row, no dividers, everyone seated elbow to elbow, gossiping or arguing while doing their business. Sponges on sticks were passed around. Water was used to rinse, not always to flush. And beneath it all, quite literally, were the earliest forms of sewers, cesspits, and sometimes just plain open ditches. Sanitation was a mirror of a society's values. Where it was neglected, chaos followed. Where it was engineered, civilization bloomed. And if you're brave enough to look past the filth, you'll discover a hidden history, one where pipes, pits, and poop tell us more about ancient life than monuments ever could. Long before the Romans laid down aqueducts, or the Greeks dreamed of public baths, the people of the Indus Valley were already solving one of civilization's dirtiest problems: sanitation. Dating back to around 2600 BCE, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, located in what is now modern-day Pakistan, were surprisingly advanced in their urban planning, particularly when it came to managing human waste. At first glance, the remains of these ancient cities might seem like nothing more than dusty ruins. But look closer, and you'll find a highly organized network of brick-lined streets with standardized measurements and, most impressively, covered drainage systems running alongside them. Yes, while much of the world was still digging holes in the ground, the Indus people had figured out how to keep their cities flowing and their homes clean. Each house, even modest ones, had a small room designated for washing, often featuring a squat-style toilet or bathing area connected to a vertical chute. This chute funneled waste into a covered brick drain outside, which then joined larger public sewers. These were not rudimentary ditches. They were engineered, with inspection holes, gradients, and even brick baffles to catch solids. Some scholars suggest that waste from wealthier homes was flushed using jars of water, gravity doing the rest. And the genius didn't stop at toilets. The Indus system also separated stormwater from waste. Public wells dotted the streets, and while we can't say for sure how water safety was ensured, the very presence of sanitation infrastructure implies a high regard for public health, rare for its time. But perhaps most stunning of all, the lack of palaces or temples in these cities. The Indus people were apparently more concerned with equality and urban function than divine monuments, and their toilet systems reflect that: practical, widespread, and surprisingly democratic. Sadly, much about the Indus civilization remains mysterious. Their writing system is still undeciphered, and we don't know exactly why their cities eventually declined. But their toilets, the silent brick channels buried beneath their feet, still speak volumes. In an age when many empires ruled through spectacle, the Indus chose something quieter, cleaner, and arguably more civilized. While the Indus Valley engineered underground sewers, the ancient Egyptians approached sanitation with a different lens, one steeped in ritual, status, and a deeply held belief in physical and spiritual purity. For them, cleanliness wasn't just about avoiding disease. It was a form of worship. In the Nile-fed civilization of ancient Egypt, bathing was an essential daily routine, especially for the wealthy. Homes of the elite often featured small limestone basins or bathing rooms, where servants would pour water for washing. Oils, natron, a natural salt, and perfumed ointments were commonly used, and hair removal was routine. But when it came to toilets, things got a little more practical. Toilets in ancient Egypt ranged from simple pits lined with sand to more refined limestone or wooden seats placed above ceramic pots. These pots were emptied by servants or slaves and dumped far from living quarters, ideally into the desert. In wealthier homes, these seats might be tucked away in private quarters, hinting at the growing association between sanitation and status. Public sanitation, however, was virtually non-existent. Streets in cities like Thebes or Memphis were often soiled, and while waste was sometimes used as fertilizer in rural areas, it wasn't always managed responsibly in urban centres. Instead, the focus remained on personal cleanliness. Priests, for example, were required to bathe multiple times a day, shave their bodies, and avoid impurities. They couldn't enter temples without ritual washing, which sometimes included enemas, not for health reasons, but as spiritual preparation. Interestingly, tombs of pharaohs and nobles occasionally included toilet stools among their grave goods. It seems the ancient Egyptians expected that even in the afterlife, one would still need to do their business, and do it with dignity. The Egyptians also made early attempts at pest control. Amulets, spells, and ointments were used to ward off flies and other carriers of disease. In this way, cleanliness straddled the physical and the mystical. In short, while Egypt didn't develop large-scale sewer systems, it pioneered a cultural emphasis on hygiene. Their obsession with purity influenced medicine, religion, and daily life. And though their toilets may have been simple, their ideas about cleanliness were anything but. While most of Bronze Age Europe was squatting over pits, the Minoans of Crete were flushing. Yes, flushing. Over 3,500 years ago. The Minoan civilization, which flourished from roughly 2000 to 1400 BCE, developed one of the most sophisticated plumbing systems in the ancient world. Their capital at Knossos wasn't just home to labyrinth myths and frescoes. It also had multi-story buildings with running water and working toilets. The Minoans understood something that many civilizations wouldn't figure out for centuries: gravity and water pressure. Their palaces had terracotta pipes laid beneath the floors and inside walls, channeling rainwater and spring water into fountains, baths, and, perhaps most notably, latrines. In the Queen's Megaron of Knossos, archaeologists discovered what may be the oldest known flush toilet: a wooden seat set over a stone basin connected to a vertical pipe, which could be flushed with water manually poured from a vessel. Bathing was also a high priority. The Minoans constructed large ceramic bathtubs, not unlike those found in modern homes. Water could be supplied from rooftop tanks or aqueducts and drained through underground channels. The use of U-shaped water traps to block odours, a precursor to the modern plumbing trap, has even been proposed, though this remains debated. What's particularly striking is the integration of these systems into elite homes, suggesting that comfort and cleanliness were signs of prestige. Unlike later Roman latrines, which were public and communal, Minoan sanitation leaned private. Your toilet was in your own home, a luxury even many 19th century Europeans didn't have. The Minoans weren't just practical, they were stylish about it. Their bathrooms were decorated with colourful frescoes and elegant plasterwork. Sanitation, it seems, could be both functional and fashionable. Unfortunately, the fall of the Minoan civilization around 1450 BCE, possibly due to volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, or invasions, led to the loss of these innovations. It would take over 1,000 years for similar toilet technology to re-emerge in other parts of the Mediterranean. Still, the ruins of Knossos whisper a simple truth. The desire to stay clean, flush away waste, and bathe in privacy isn't a modern obsession. It's ancient, deeply human, and, in the case of the Minoans, impressively advanced. When it comes to ancient sanitation, no civilization made a bigger, bolder statement than the Romans. By the height of the Roman Empire, they had mastered the art of infrastructure: aqueducts, roads, And yes, toilets. For the Romans, sanitation wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about civilization itself. And that meant making toilets public, efficient, and, surprisingly, social. Walk into any major Roman city, from Pompeii to Londinium, and you'd likely find public latrines, open rooms with long stone benches, each carved with evenly spaced holes. No stalls, no dividers, just elbow-to-elbow seating. Beneath the benches ran a steady stream of water to carry away waste, and a secondary channel held sponge sticks, tessoria, the Roman answer to toilet paper. These sponges were rinsed communally in water and vinegar, then reused. Hygienic? Not quite. Functional? Very. For the Romans, using the toilet wasn't a private ordeal. It was a social event. People chatted, gossiped, conducted business, all while taking care of nature's call. Latrines were often decorated with mosaics or inscriptions, some of them humorous or even crude. Graffiti inside Pompeii's latrines includes complaints about bad smells, poor plumbing, and, of course, rude users. But Roman sanitation extended far beyond toilets. Their cities were crisscrossed with cloaca, enormous sewer systems, the most famous being the Cloaca Maxima in Rome. Built initially to drain marshes, it became the backbone of Rome's waste management system. Rainwater, urine, and feces all flowed through it, fed by aqueducts that brought in fresh water from miles away. In private homes, wealthier Romans had indoor latrines that emptied into cesspits or directly into the sewers. The poor relied on chamber pots, which were sometimes dumped from windows into the street, despite laws forbidding it. Apartment dwellers, especially in insulae, multi-story tenements, suffered the worst. Many buildings lacked plumbing entirely, and the lower floors often flooded with sewage. Interestingly, Romans taxed urine. Emperor Vespasian even instituted a pee tax on public urinals, a move so infamous that his name is still associated with urinals in France and Italy today. In short, Roman toilets weren't just advanced. They were loud, crowded, political, and strangely progressive, offering perhaps the first large-scale attempt at truly communal sanitation. While the Romans embraced public defecation like a community picnic, the ancient Greeks took a more modest approach. To them, bodily functions were personal, something to be handled quietly, discreetly, and preferably alone. That said, they still made significant contributions to sanitation and cleanliness, just in a very different tone. In most Greek homes, the toilet was simple, a clay pot or stone seat over a cesspit. There were no flushing systems, no sewer connections in ordinary residences. The waste was usually collected and manually emptied, often by slaves, into pits or dumped in remote areas. Urban streets sometimes included open drains, but as cities grew, so did the smell. Sanitation was a problem, but not always a priority. Yet the Greeks were obsessed with bathing. Gymnasia, where men exercised naked, were almost always connected to large public bathhouses. These weren't just for scrubbing off sweat. They were central social institutions, places to network, debate philosophy, and prepare for civic life. Unlike Roman baths, which were extravagant and filled with marble, Greek baths were simpler, often circular tubs, cold water basins, or shallow pools. Water management was crucial to this culture of bathing. The Greeks built aqueducts, cisterns, and terracotta pipe systems to supply fresh water to cities like Athens. In fact, the Athenian agora had one of the earliest known examples of a public latrine, complete with stone seats and a drainage system. But these remained rare. The public toilet was never truly normalized in Greek society as it was in Rome. What the Greeks lacked in plumbing, they made up for in theory. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, was among the first to link sanitation to health. He suggested that dirty water and filth could spread disease, a radical idea at the time. His recommendations for clean air, fresh water, and dry housing would later influence Roman city planning. The irony is stark. The civilization that gave us democracy and drama still preferred to handle its dirtiest business in private. Sanitation, for the Greeks, was not about infrastructure. It was about individual discipline and philosophical hygiene, clean body, clean mind. And while their latrines may have been crude, their obsession with purity, physical and moral, helped lay the foundation for modern public health thinking. In ancient China, cleanliness was both a personal duty and a reflection of cosmic balance. Sanitation, while not as infrastructure-heavy as in Rome or the Indus Valley, was still deeply woven into daily life, through customs, philosophies, and a surprisingly wide range of toilet tools. Most ancient Chinese homes did not have toilets in the modern sense. Instead, chamber pots were the norm. These portable ceramic or bronze containers came in all shapes and sizes, from utilitarian to ornate, depending on one's status. After use, servants or family members would empty the pots into larger household cesspits or take them outside the city walls. Some rural families used human waste, known as night soil, as fertilizer, a practice that continued for centuries. Public toilets did exist, especially in larger cities like Chang'an or Luoyang. These communal facilities were often basic pits or troughs, with wooden platforms to sit or squat on. Interestingly, some of these toilets had privacy screens, a courtesy not often found in ancient Rome. Waste from these locations was usually collected and reused in agriculture, which, while efficient, also carried risks of contamination and disease. Toilet paper, or something very close to it, may have originated in China. As early as the 2nd century BCE, people were using soft papers, often discarded writings, for hygiene. By the 6th century CE, scholars recorded the use of paper specifically for cleaning after defecation. The elite preferred silk scraps or bamboo spatulas washed between uses. Yes, you read that correctly. Polished bamboo sticks were among the earliest reusable wiping tools. Sanitation wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Influenced by Confucian ideals of order and respect, and Taoist beliefs in harmony and purity, hygiene was linked to self-discipline and balance. Excrement, though natural, was seen as a pollutant, something to be swiftly removed and never discussed in polite company. Imperial households took this to the extreme, with specially appointed eunuchs managing waste disposal in complete secrecy. Despite the lack of underground sewers, ancient China maintained fairly clean urban centres thanks to meticulous human labour, cultural taboos, and a well-organised system of waste collection. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Through chamber pots, composting, and paper wipes, the Chinese found their own path to sanitation, one that was humble, efficient, and deeply rooted in tradition. When it comes to ancient sanitation, the Vikings might not be the first group that comes to mind. Known more for their raids than their routines, Norse hygiene was actually more sophisticated and surprisingly disciplined than stereotypes suggest. Beneath the horned helmet myths lies a culture that, while rough around the edges, took personal cleanliness and waste management more seriously than much of medieval Europe. In Viking settlements, especially in places like Jorvik, modern-day York, England, and Hedeby in modern Germany, archaeologists have uncovered latrine pits lined with timber or stone, basic, functional toilets used by both individuals and households. These pits were often dug a short distance from homes and were sometimes covered by wooden structures to provide privacy and shelter from the harsh northern climate. The waste from these latrines, a combination of human excrement, food scraps, and animal remains, tells us more than just what Vikings ate. It shows that they had a method of centralized waste disposal. In some cases, these pits were periodically cleaned out and reused. In others, new pits were simply dug when the old ones filled. Some evidence even suggests early composting practices, as waste would naturally decompose and return to the soil over time. Inside homes, chamber pots and buckets were common, especially during long, frozen winters when stepping outside wasn't exactly ideal. These were usually emptied into latrine pits or dung heaps near the outskirts of a settlement. While not glamorous, it was practical, and far more sanitary than throwing waste into the street. a practice common in some medieval cities. But hygiene wasn't just functional, it was cultural. Vikings bathed regularly, often once a week, usually on lagdaga, washing day, the origin of the English word Saturday. Combs, ear cleaners, and tweezers made from bone or antler are common finds in Norse archaeological sites. Personal grooming mattered, not just for appearance but for social status and marriage prospects. While Viking sanitation lacked the engineering feats of Rome or the ritual purity of Egypt, it was rooted in pragmatism. They didn't build sewers or invent toilet paper, but they managed their waste, kept clean, and adapted to a harsh environment with earthy, no-nonsense solutions. In the land of ice and iron, even the business of doing your business was handled with the blunt efficiency of a people who didn't have time for fuss. Across civilizations and centuries, one truth remains constant. No society could thrive without figuring out what to do with its waste. From the hidden sewers of the Indus Valley to the communal latrines of Rome and the chamber pots of ancient China, humanity's relationship with sanitation has always walked a fine line between necessity and neglect. What's striking is how different cultures prioritized hygiene. Some, like the Romans and Minoans, invested heavily in infrastructure. They built aqueducts, flush systems, and sewage networks that, in some cases, rivaled the functionality of 19th century cities. Others, like the Greeks and Chinese, placed cleanliness in the realm of personal virtue, linking it to health, ethics, and harmony with nature. Still others, like the Vikings, took a ruggedly practical approach. Dig a pit, wash when you can, and don't let filth fester near your food. Despite their differences, these societies were all working toward the same goal: separating people from their waste. The reasons varied: to prevent disease, to honour the gods, to preserve public order. But the outcome shaped how cities grew, how laws were made, and how people viewed their bodies. Ironically, much of this ancient wisdom was lost during the Middle Ages in Europe. After the fall of Rome, sophisticated sanitation systems crumbled, public toilets disappeared, sewers clogged, disease surged. It would take centuries and multiple plagues for urban planners to revisit ideas the ancients had already mastered. And yet, traces of ancient sanitation still remain today. The word latrine comes from the Latin latrina. The modern flush toilet owes a distant debt to Minoan gravity systems. Even our use of paper in the bathroom was foreshadowed by the Chinese over 1,000 years ago. What feels modern is, in many cases, just rediscovered. Sanitation, often overlooked in historical narratives, is a quiet backbone of civilization. It doesn't inspire poems or monuments, but without it, cities collapse, populations suffer, and even empires can fall. So next time you walk into a restroom and enjoy the luxury of privacy, plumbing, and maybe even scented soap, remember, you're standing on the shoulders of generations who tried, failed, and sometimes succeeded in figuring out how to keep the filth at bay. And that, perhaps, is civilization's most underrated achievement. Before satellites, compasses, or even writing, humans had an instinct to map, not just to record where things were, but to make sense of their place in a vast and often terrifying world. A map wasn't just a picture of terrain. It was a story, a belief system, a survival manual. It told people where the rivers flowed, where the sun rose, where the spirits dwelled, and where danger waited just beyond the known. Some of the earliest maps weren't drawn on parchment or paper. They were etched into stone, scratched onto bone, or woven into oral memory. Prehistoric carvings from the Upper Paleolithic period, over 14,000 years ago, show animals, riverbanks, and clusters of huts. Were they maps in the modern sense? Not quite. But they captured space in relation to movement and meaning, a fundamental start. As early societies emerged and trade routes expanded, maps became essential tools of power. They guided merchants through mountains and deserts. They helped kings draw borders and tax their subjects. They even tried to explain the cosmos, mixing astronomy with theology. To map the stars was to touch the divine. To draw a city was to impose order on chaos. But mapping wasn't always about accuracy. In fact, ancient maps were often wildly distorted by today's standards. What mattered was meaning, not measurement. The centre of the world was always home, whether that was Babylon, Jerusalem, or the island of Delos. Lands grew or shrank depending on their importance. Unknown regions were filled with fantastical beasts or labelled simply, "Here be dragons." Some cultures didn't even use flat maps at all. Polynesian navigators, for instance, crafted stick charts that recorded ocean currents and island swells, not for the eye, but for the hands and the mind. These weren't meant to be read like modern maps, but felt and memorized through ritual training. The instinct to map, to visualize space, time, and position, is deeply human. Whether carved in clay, painted on walls, or sung in chants, maps helped ancient people connect with their environment, their gods, and each other. And while their methods varied wildly, their goal was always the same: to find their place in a mysterious and shifting world. In the cradle of civilization, amid the temples and ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia, the Babylonians began carving the first known maps into clay. These weren't just practical tools for land ownership or city planning. They were cosmic documents, attempts to impose order on a chaotic world by capturing it in cuneiform lines and symbols. One of the most famous examples is the Imago Mundi, a clay tablet dated to the 6th century BCE, now housed in the British Museum. It's often cited as the oldest known world map. At just 6 inches across, it's a tiny window into the Babylonian universe. At its centre sits Babylon itself, shown as a rectangle, surrounded by a circular landmass representing the known world. The Euphrates River cuts through the middle, and various cities, mountains, and regions are labelled in cuneiform. Beyond the world is a bitter river, likely the ocean, and then mysterious triangular islands, each with mythological descriptions. These weren't real places. They were symbolic zones of chaos and danger, the outer limits of what could be known. To the Babylonians, mapping wasn't just geographic, it was spiritual. The heavens were mapped just as carefully as the earth. Babylonian astronomers tracked planetary movements, lunar cycles, and eclipses with stunning precision, all inscribed onto clay tablets with reed styluses. These celestial records weren't only scientific, they were used to predict omens and divine the future. The map of the sky was a guide to fate. On a more local scale, land surveys were common and practical. Clay tablets from as early as 2300 BCE record detailed plots of farmland, with notes on boundaries, irrigation canals, and ownership. These were the tools of bureaucrats, tax collectors, and priests. Precision mattered here, not for navigation, but for managing wealth and resources. Babylonian maps reveal a people obsessed with structure, not just physical, but metaphysical. They mapped the world as they understood it, with themselves at the centre, surrounded by rivers, enemies, gods, and mysteries. These maps weren't just records. They were expressions of belief, power, and a desire to make the unknowable a little more knowable. While the Babylonians mapped the world with mythic rings and cosmic rivers, the ancient Egyptians turned their attention to something far more grounded, the land itself. In the floodplains of the Nile, mapping wasn't abstract. It was about control, survival, and the sacred geometry of a kingdom that stretched from desert cliffs to delta marshes. The Egyptians didn't produce world maps in the Babylonian sense. Instead, their cartography was deeply practical. Every year, the Nile flooded, erasing boundary markers and farmland divisions. To restore order, surveyors, called harpedonapte, used ropes, measuring rods, and sighting tools to redraw the grid. This wasn't a one-time ritual, it was an annual necessity. Mapping became a state function, tightly controlled by temple scribes and royal officials. Surviving papyri show maps of remarkable precision. One of the oldest known is the Turin Papyrus map, dating to around 1160 BCE. It's not decorative or mythological, it's a mining map, a literal layout of wadis, hills, and gold-bearing regions in the eastern desert. Streams, roads, quarry sites, and annotations in hieratic script mark distances and mineral types. This was a working map for officials and labour crews, not something hung on a palace wall. But Egyptian maps weren't entirely devoid of symbolism. Temples were often built in alignment with celestial events, and cities were laid out with cosmological order in mind. The map wasn't just a tool, it was a manifestation of Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of balance and harmony. Land division and urban planning followed sacred principles. Even pyramids and tombs were oriented with mathematical and astronomical precision. In religious texts, we also find conceptual maps of the underworld, such as those in the Book of the Dead or the Amduat. These spiritual maps depicted the journey of the soul through 12 hours of night, guarded by serpents, gods, and gates. They weren't navigational, but they were cartographic in spirit, guiding the deceased through the terrain of eternity. Egyptian cartography, then, was a blend of bureaucracy and belief. Whether measuring a farmer's plot or charting the afterlife, maps were instruments of divine order. They weren't just about finding one's way on Earth, they were about ensuring alignment with the gods. The Greeks didn't invent maps, but they revolutionized how maps were thought about. For the first time in recorded history, space wasn't just described, it was measured, calculated, and reasoned. Geography transformed from a practical necessity into an intellectual pursuit, one that would lay the groundwork for modern cartography. Enter Anaximander, a philosopher from Miletus, who in the 6th century BCE is credited with creating one of the first conceptual maps of the world. Though the original has been lost, sources describe it as a circular disk, with land masses like Europe and Asia spread around a central Mediterranean. It was symbolic, yes, but it also marked a break from mythic cosmologies. Anaximander was attempting to represent the physical world in a rational format. Then came Hecataeus, who refined these early ideas and expanded them through travel and inquiry. His map was accompanied by a geographical text called Periegesis, which detailed lands, customs, and peoples. But it was Claudius Ptolemy, centuries later, who would change the game entirely. Ptolemy's Geographia, written in the 2nd century CE, was a masterwork of Greek science. It contained detailed instructions for map-making, a list of over 8,000 place names with coordinates, and a grid-based system of latitude and longitude, long before GPS was even a dream. He also introduced projections to represent the curved Earth on a flat surface, an idea that still challenges modern cartographers. Greek maps weren't just practical tools, they were also windows into how the Greeks saw the world. The oikoumene, the inhabited world, was surrounded by oceans and barbarian lands, but the Greeks placed themselves at the intellectual centre. The further from Greece, the more distorted the geography, reflecting both limited knowledge and cultural bias. Interestingly, Greek thinkers also wrestled with the idea of a spherical Earth. Eratosthenes, working in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, calculated the Earth's circumference using little more than shadows, geometry, and a stick. He was remarkably accurate, off by only a few hundred miles. Greek cartography was more than drawing lines. It was about decoding the Earth's shape, size, and place in the cosmos. With math, logic, and ambition, the Greeks turned maps from myth into science, and the world would never look the same again. If the Greeks gave us the theory of cartography, the Romans gave us its full military and logistical application. The Roman Empire wasn't just held together by laws and legions. It was stitched into one unit by a vast and meticulously maintained road network. And to keep it functioning, the Romans created some of the most practical and powerful maps of the ancient world. Unlike Greek maps, which aimed to describe the shape of the earth or explore the heavens, Roman maps were grounded in movement. They were tools of control, expansion, taxation, and supply. At the center of it all was the phrase, "All roads lead to Rome." And for the Romans, that wasn't a metaphor. It was a mapping philosophy. Perhaps the most famous Roman map is the Tabula Peutingeriana, a 4th century CE copy of a much older Roman road map. It's not geographically accurate in the modern sense. Land masses are stretched and distorted, but it serves its purpose perfectly, showing routes, stops, distances, and connections across the empire, from Britain to India. Imagine a modern subway map, where spatial accuracy is sacrificed for clarity of movement. That's Roman mapping in a nutshell. Way stations, or mansions, were marked at regular intervals, complete with distances in Roman miles. These maps allowed military commanders, merchants, and messengers to travel efficiently across thousands of kilometers. They knew where to change horses, where to rest, and how long it would take to reach the next city. The empire became navigable, not just in the field, but on parchment. In addition to road maps, the Romans also commissioned cadastral maps, highly detailed records of land ownership and boundaries, used for taxation and legal disputes. Some were carved in bronze and posted in public places, so citizens could see exactly who owned what. Control of land was control of power, and the Romans understood that with brutal clarity. Interestingly, the Romans showed less interest in mapping the whole earth or the heavens. Their focus was always on what could be conquered, travelled, or taxed. The map wasn't a cosmic vision, it was a spreadsheet with roads. And yet, by making the empire legible, Roman maps created something enduring, a sense of shared space, of belonging to something bigger than your town or tribe. It was cartography as empire, functional, detailed, and ruthlessly efficient. While Roman maps emphasized roads and administration, ancient Chinese cartography pursued a harmony between territory, governance, and the cosmos. In China, maps were never just geographical tools. They were political documents, philosophical statements, and celestial mirrors. To map the land was to understand one's place under heaven and to rule it properly. Some of the earliest known maps in China date back to the 4th century BCE, discovered in tombs like the one at Mawangdui. These silk maps show rivers, roads, and military positions, not drawn to scale, but incredibly detailed for their time. They weren't made for travellers. They were buried with the dead, perhaps to guide the spirit or to demonstrate the deceased's command of territory. By the Han dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, cartography had matured. Officials used maps to govern the empire's vast provinces, record taxation zones, and plan military campaigns. Surveying tools like the groma and sighting instruments helped measure land with surprising accuracy. Some Han maps even included coordinate grids, centuries before they appeared in the West. One of the most influential Chinese geographers was Pei Shu, active in the 3rd century CE. He established principles for scientific map-making, emphasizing scale, direction, and consistent measurement, ideas that would become foundational to later Chinese and Korean mapping traditions. His work was so respected that he was dubbed the father of Chinese cartography. But Chinese maps weren't only concerned with Earth. Cosmological charts were deeply important. The Chinese sky was mapped in constellations grouped into celestial palaces and symbolic animals, the azure dragon of the east, the white tiger of the west, and so on. These star maps guided everything from agriculture to imperial rituals. The emperor, as the son of heaven, was believed to rule in alignment with celestial order. If his maps, and by extension his governance, fell out of harmony, so did his right to rule. In China, the map was not merely a tool of bureaucracy. It was a bridge between heaven and earth. Whether carved into stone, painted on silk, or etched into bronze, a map represented more than land. It reflected the emperor's ability to impose clarity on the chaos of the world. Far from the massive empires of Eurasia, the Polynesians developed one of the most unique and abstract forms of mapping the world, one that didn't rely on paper, ink, or scale, but on deep experience and intuitive memory. These were the stick charts of the Marshall Islands, and they represented a radically different way of understanding geography, not by land, but by sea. The Polynesians were master navigators. Thousands of years before European explorers crossed the Atlantic, they were sailing vast stretches of the Pacific, navigating by stars, swells, bird behavior, and cloud patterns. With no compasses or written language, their maps had to function differently. Not as static images, but as memory aids and tactile guides for apprentice navigators. Stick charts were built from thin coconut fronds or wooden strips, lashed together with twine. The curves represented ocean swells, which behaved predictably in open water. Small shells or knots marked islands. The arrangement of the sticks captured wave refraction and interference patterns, knowledge that allowed navigators to read the ocean's surface like a road map. There were different types of charts. Rebelib charts covered entire archipelagos, while Meadow focused on smaller regions or specific voyages. Then there were matang, abstract teaching tools used to explain wave behavior near islands. These weren't meant to be carried on voyages. Instead, they were studied, memorized, and internalized. A skilled navigator could cross hundreds of miles using only their senses and what they'd learned from the stick chart. To the untrained eye, these maps looked like broken ladders or art installations. But to a Polynesian wayfinder, they represented deep ecological knowledge, built not from conquest or geometry, but from a close and respectful relationship with nature. Polynesian cartography challenged the Western notion that a map must be visual and literal. Their maps were physical, experiential, and often invisible during travel. It wasn't about recording space, it was about feeling it. In many ways, these charts blur the line between science and spirituality. They were passed down through oral tradition, guarded by navigation schools, and held sacred. And in an ocean that could swallow even the boldest sailor, they helped the Polynesians find their way, not just across water, but through memory, rhythm, and ancestral knowledge. As the ancient world gave way to the medieval era, maps began to shift from scientific observation to symbolic interpretation. In many parts of the world, especially in Europe, cartography became more about representing spiritual truths and less about physical accuracy. The result? Maps filled with monsters, paradise, demons, and a worldview where the centre of geography was often the centre of belief. One of the most iconic medieval map types is the TO map, which dominated European thinking from the early Middle Ages to the Renaissance. These maps depicted the world as a circle, the O, divided by a T into three parts: Asia on top, Europe to the lower left, and Africa to the lower right. Jerusalem often sat at the centre, reinforcing the religious heart of the known world. East was usually at the top, not north, because that's where the Garden of Eden was believed to be. These maps weren't meant for navigation. They were theological tools, reinforcing a Christian cosmology where the world's geography aligned with biblical history. Lands were labelled with the names of Noah's sons, and the unknown regions, beyond the edges, were populated by monstrous races, people with dog heads, feet like umbrellas, or faces in their chests. The further from Jerusalem, the stranger things got. But not all medieval maps were purely symbolic. Some, like the Tabula Rogeriana, created by Arab geographer al-Idrisi in the 12th century, combined empirical observation with artistic flair. Commissioned by a Norman king in Sicily, this massive silver map was based on interviews with travellers, traders and sailors from across the Muslim and Christian worlds. It was far more detailed and practical than its European counterparts, and it placed south at the top, a common feature in Islamic cartography. Meanwhile, Jewish, Indian and Buddhist traditions also produced conceptual world maps, not focused on navigation, but on metaphysical structure. Mount Meru, for instance, featured as the cosmic axis in many Indian and Tibetan maps, surrounded by symbolic continents and divine realms. These medieval maps remind us that mapping isn't just about where things are, it's about what people believe the world means. In an age where the horizon still held terror and mystery, the map wasn't just a guide, it was a mirror of the soul. As the world grew larger in the minds of humans, so too did our desire to capture it, not only to get from point A to B, but to understand who we are, where we came from, and what surrounds us. Ancient maps, with all their flaws, distortions, and symbols, laid the foundation for the modern world's obsession with space, borders, and precision. What ties all ancient maps together is not accuracy, but intention. Babylonian tablets weren't meant to help you find a street. They showed the spiritual structure of the universe. Egyptian maps helped tax collectors and priests maintain divine order in a landscape governed by floods and gods. Greek maps introduced scale, geometry, and the bold idea that the world could be measured. Roman road maps stitched a vast empire together, helping legions, messengers, and merchants move like clockwork. Chinese maps fused astronomy with governance, always striving to reflect harmony between heaven and earth. Then there were the outliers. The Polynesian stick charts, tactile and abstract, showing that not all maps had to be seen. Some were meant to be felt and remembered. And the medieval religious maps filled with beasts and paradise, which told viewers not just where the world was, but what it meant. Even the flaws in ancient maps are informative. They show us what mattered to a culture, what was centered, what was feared, what was sacred. These maps remind us that geography is never neutral. It reflects priorities, power, myth, and memory. The Greeks put themselves in the middle. So did the Chinese. So did the Europeans. Everyone was the center of their own world. Today, with satellite imaging and digital precision, we can chart the planet down to the last meter. But the core impulse behind cartography remains the same as it was thousands of years ago. The human need to orient ourselves in something larger than ourselves. Whether it's a papyrus scroll, a clay tablet, or a glowing phone screen, every map answers the same ancient question. Where am I?